Hernán López from University of Ibagué. They are in charge of the conversation today. So, Hernán?
So, well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this Cybernetic Systems Interactions. Today, we're, as I think Igor hand over to you short notes of the presentation. We're going to have this cyber-theatrical presentation. We're going to exemplify with the work of Tom Scholte, a pioneer in this cyber-theatrical arts for modeling and complex systems. We're going to have a presentation of a case study, but first, I would like very briefly to set a framework within which that presentation is going to be conducted. So we can see in this slide that, before I read the slide, the context within which we're going to make the presentation is this increasing interaction between art and system thinking. In that context, there are at least 3 different types of interactions that we have identified. One of them, as the slide shows, is art teaches system thinkers the art of attunement. Later on, we can talk about that. Another one is art helps cybernetic modeling of complex systems, which is what Tom is going to show us today. Another one is in systemic interventions, art facilitates knowledge, dialogues, and the creation of a common language to bridge communication between system thinkers and communities. We are going to show then an example of how art helps cybernetic modeling of complex systems. And later, we can talk about not only the case study that Tom is going to present, but the concepts and conceptual frameworks behind this interaction between systems thinking and art. So, Tom, dear Tom, you have the stage.
Thank you so much, and again, my apologies to everyone for being late, struggling with the link. My apologies. Thank you all so much for your patience. So I'm going to keep this brief, as I understand these sessions are really designed to have a very brief sort of presentation and then time for discussion. So I'm going to give quite a sort of truncated discussion of this presentation of this case study. And first, a huge thank you to Alfonso and to Igor for their kind invitation to be able to talk about this to you today. So the ways that I'm doing this work is coming out of the tradition of Augusto Boal's Theater of the Oppressed, using interactive modes of theater in a program at my home university, the University of British Columbia, called Conflict Theater at UBC, where we use form theater, interactive theater, to explore workplace conflict, largely to try and help people build their own facility, their own capacity to engage in difficult conversations. So while at the same time it serves a modeling function to be able to show the types of interactions, because it's interactive and audience members replace characters in the play, step inside the play, and try and solve the issues inside the play using a different approach than what's initially in the play. It's also again focusing on the individual actor as cybernetician, so to speak, as someone who has to steer themselves through an interaction, and someone who implicitly, because of their embeddedness inside an organization, is helping steer the organization in some direction. And it's really a response to the fact that while we have formal complaint processes at our university, as most do, those processes, those offices are drowning. They are swamped with formal complaints. And often that is because people are either really conflict averse, so they will not feel they have the skills to step into a conflict, And then when things get bad enough, they feel the only place they can go is to a formal complaint. And so this whole zone in the middle of actually trying to have a conversation with someone with whom one is in conflict is completely passed over, sometimes for good reasons because of power dynamics and different kinds of oppressive dynamics. But where are those opportunities where some dialogue might be possible? So we have a community of practice, and in one session we weren't doing a full play. We were simply doing a something called blank forum, which is a very simple setup. You have an actor from the community sitting behind a desk who's character A, and someone comes up to the desk who's character B. And the scenario is very simple. Actor B approaches the desk. Actor A says one line, "You are out of line," and then gets up and leaves. That's the whole scenario. The audience is then invited, if there is something about that brief interaction that resonates for them as reminding them of a difficult interaction they've been in, they replace character B. And when character A tries to leave, they just start talking to them, and very quickly the scenario develops. And so the actor playing character A has to very quickly listen to the what's coming at them and take on the character from the person's scenario and play out this improvisation. So in this session, someone came forward, and in the place of character B, they played someone who was had caught a student cheating, or they believed they had caught a student cheating, and they were trying to enforce the rules. And the Office of Accommodations, where people go when they have a mental health accommodation or some kind of illness where they can't complete their homework in time, is on the other side of the interaction. And the person who'd stepped in was getting increasingly angry because they felt it was a very clear-cut case of cheating, and the person from the accommodations office is trying to get them to slow down, think about it, maybe there's another explanation. And the person who thought the person had cheated was getting increasingly heated and angry. And then when the improvisation stopped, we turned to the audience for observations. And one of the observations that came from one of the community members was, they said, well, it seemed like you were in the right, that the character had cheated. You had the moral high ground, but the way you went after it, the vehemence with which you were stepping into, the emotional dynamics of the way that you were pursuing this thing that seemed that you were right about. He used this phrase. He said, it seemed like this was your white whale. Now, for those of you familiar with the novel Moby Dick, that image, that metaphor will resonate for you. So it was interesting for us that doing this artistic practice, what was fed back was something from another work of art that someone grabbed as a metaphor that was resonant for the interactive dynamics of what they were witnessing. The person stopped and thought, you just resonating with the concept of the white whale, thought, oh my God, yes, I have experience in the past where feeling that I'm being taken advantage of, feeling that someone is taking advantage of my goodwill, it triggers these feelings from my past about this. And those are actually showing up inside this interaction that I'm having. And this person then reflected further on another example of a case of a plagiarism case they had been involved in, where once again, they had the moral high ground, but the way they had approached it ended up getting them on the end of a bullying and harassment complaint, even though they were in the right. There was something about the emotional dynamics that was being triggered that was causing them to behave in a manner that the dynamics of the interaction were unhealthy, even if they were in the right. So this notion of the white whale, then we took up, and because this training program, the conflict theater, is embedded in various leadership training programs in the university, we have a course developing called An Introduction to Conflict Engagement, and we've decided to put the white whale as an actual device that someone can use to determine where they're at in a conflict and whether they want to, how they want to step into this conflict, because we have a series of steps that someone can take. You can just drop a conflict and not take it up. You can engage directly. You can engage and ask for support. You can have mediation, or you can launch a formal complaint. And as I mentioned, people tend to ignore this big place in the middle. So this course is trying to encourage people to look at when it's possible to drop a conflict, and also look at if it's possible to step in. So we've added something to the course entirely around this white whale. I'm just going to read it to you. It's very brief. And it's called Beware the White Whale, and it exists online in this course. For most of us, there are kinds of everyday behavior we witness that, without reaching the threshold of abuse and not always directly impacting our ability to complete our work, really gets under our skin. If we repeatedly see this behavior in someone we work with, we can begin to develop strong negative feelings towards that individual and may have increasing difficulty not reacting to the behavior. This can be particularly true if the person or their behavior reminds us of someone from our past who we feel has harmed us. Speaking metaphorically, inspired by the classic novel Moby Dick, the person or behavior may become our white whale. And without sufficient self-awareness and sound judgment, this can create the same kinds of problems for us that it does for Captain Ahab in the novel. And then I put spoiler alert as we go into this. Captain Ahab is in command of a whaling ship. His job is to catch as many whales as he can with the help of his crew. In the past, Captain Ahab was injured by a particular white whale known as Moby Dick, who bit off the lower part of one of his legs. Since that time, he has been obsessed with getting even with that whale that harmed him. It becomes his obsession, and he takes that obsession to work with him. Throughout the novel, Ahab steers his ship away from perfectly good hunting grounds that are likely to be full of whales he and his crew could catch, and heads towards less promising waters simply because he has heard a rumor that Moby Dick might be there. He continually puts his whole crew and the money of his investors at risk in pursuit of satisfying his obsession. Finally, he does indeed find and confront Moby Dick, and in a fearsome battle, he and his entire crew but one are drowned. While author Herman Melville might not have described it in these words, Moby Dick is a workplace drama. It's the story of an individual whose personal injuries and resentments, however legitimate and understandable, impact the way he conducts himself in his workplace. His job is to catch whales, not be avenged on Moby Dick, but he allows his workplace to become the vehicle through which he can achieve the latter. This inability to separate his work from his personal grievances proves destructive and disastrous for everyone in his workplace. While Captain Ahab did not have the privilege of access to workplace coaches with whom he could have spoken about his challenges, UBC employees do. And there we put in a link to our coaching program. Or maybe there are other people in our lives or places we can go that can help us do our best to really be sure we know how to pick our battles in the workplace. Like Ahab, we may have legitimate grievances and injuries from the past that can be exacerbated in the workplace. And if someone is bullying us, harassing us, discriminating against us, or standing directly in the way of us completing the work that we need to do, then we might need to choose another conflict approach to move forward. But it can be a good idea to ask ourselves if this is the case, or are we coming up against our own white whale that would best be dealt with by talking out our issues with someone outside our immediate workplace, rather than engaging directly. So that's just a little story of how an insight emerged from this theatrical practice and how we've converted it into something that we hope is making a contribution to the overall governance of our institution through becoming a new learning method. The last thing I'll reveal, and I withheld this for a reason, is that the individual who came forward and was identified as having a white whale was actually me. And the reason I held this back was because the view of second-order cybernetics that I'm putting forward is that it needs to go beyond the idea of modeling something external. It needs to be about our own personal experience. And in a paper in which I described this white whale that I've called A Proposal for the Role of Second-Order Cybernetics in a New Model, or sorry, a proposal for the role of the arts in a new model of second-order cybernetics, I put forward the idea that when Heinz von Förster talks about a need for a theory of the observer, for me, it's not about having a general theory of observers in general. It's about the need for each of us as observers to have a general theory of ourselves. We each need to develop our own theory of ourselves as observers and the ways that our own histories impact the distinctions that we draw. And I withheld the idea that I was the protagonist of the story because of the common idea that self-narratives are unscientific. And so if I was telling you a story about my own experience, well, that's just your own experience. That's not really scientific data. I want to push back against that idea. And I even want to push back on the notion that second-order cybernetics needs to even concern itself whether or not it's taken seriously as a science. I think second-order cybernetics is a practice that draws on science and on art and on many other things. And I'm not alone in this. There are many others who have come before me. And I've drawn a lot on the work of Larry Richards to talk about this so that we can develop a theory of the observer for each of ourselves that help us in the governance of our own work and ideally how we participate in the governance of the larger organizations in which we're embedded. And I'll stop there and open it up for discussion.
Thank you very much, Tom. I don't know, Hernán, if you want to add something.
Well, yeah, I would like to emphasize that what Tom has created in the University of Vancouver, British Columbia, sorry, in Vancouver, is this unit that he is a theater for living. He is the methodology that he uses to deal with conflict, and then the emphasis there is to develop capabilities, the capacities for second-order observation in situations of workplace conflict. So that's the essence, I think, of what Tom is actually showing us today with this case study. So go ahead, Alfonso.
Regarding that, Tom, how have you managed to engage professors from the university in this kind of training for them to become aware of the importance of developing each one of them his or her own theory of you say it of being observers?
Well, you put your finger on a really difficult problem, which is that there has been a really large uptake of this work amongst staff and much less amongst professors.
All right.
Which points to a really significant problem. And many of our plays end up being about the struggles and conflicts in the power dynamic between faculty and staff. Faculty are empowered in ways, they're considered to be untouchable because of the tenure system, and staff are constantly, we did a play, we just completed our intensive for the summer. We created 4 new plays just over the last week. And one of them involves a faculty member showing up and with a last-minute job for a staff person that's going to cost them their entire weekend, and the staff person has to comply because the faculty member is untouchable. And if they show up with a deadline well past where it would be reasonable to expect the person to meet this deadline, too bad. So this is really a problem that I'm trying to wrestle with and getting more and more professors to take up this work. And it points to something, and I'll just, as a professor, I'll say this to the group. Professors seem to have a real problem with epistemic humility. They seem to be, their training has prepared them for a life of always being right, of always having the answer, and of always critiquing what's going on with someone else. And the lack of a desire to take up this reflexive practice amongst professors at the university is a real problem and is something that we're struggling with. But staff love it.
Yeah, I can believe that. But I have another question. The other people that is quite important in the university are the students, and I believe it is quite important for any students to develop that kind of skill, to be aware of the importance for each of them to be able to observe the observers they are in every interaction they go through. Have you tried to implement that in the curricula curricula of the profession, of the careers?
Yes. So in a couple places. One is, in my home department of theater and film, occasionally I get to teach, because this comes from the tradition of applied theater, Augusto Boal and others. It's recognized as a genre of theater that I'm able to teach within our curriculum in our BA program. So I get to do that. But where I've been able to bring it somewhere else is an interdisciplinary course I was involved in designing called Wicked Problems in International Development. And it was an interdisciplinary course with our Office of Regional and International Community Engagement. And we used various systems tools, both cybernetic and otherwise, to explore complex challenges in international development and to really explore the differences between the distinctions that were being drawn by people from international organizations, aid organizations, et cetera, and the local stakeholders, and how the different observations drawn are, literally generating a different reality for folks there. So continuing to find places to slide that in. And I'm fortunate that in this upcoming year, so we have an interdisciplinary graduate studies program where people can do a master's or a PhD. And they essentially design they need to get a supervisor from at least two different disciplines and make a proposal saying why these two different disciplines are necessary to the question. I've been asked to design a unifying methodology course in that program. And so I'll be leaning heavily into these methods with these graduate students. So more and more opportunities are presenting themselves to be able to do this with students. But interestingly enough, I was given a specific mandate with conflict theater that it was only for staff and faculty. There was a sense that while students need a lot of support, a large amount of our resources are directed towards student supports of various kinds, and that this was an opportunity to finally give some additional support, particularly to staff. So it was actually very clear that my work was not to involve students.
Okay.
Sorry, Tom. Just you're going to deliver this summer a course in our university, which will deal precisely with some of these questions that Alfonso is asking.
I would like to open the floor for everyone who wants to comment on that.
Yeah, I see Sarah's got a question in the chat here. Have you tried to get the teachers to at least see the play? Because sometimes just being exposed is enough to generate an internal movement in the observer. Yeah, and you raise a good point too that we were asked a question about, because in terms of the kinds of learning outcomes, some people who have questioned us have said, oh, that's really cool, but isn't it really just the people who intervene themselves and get on stage that have a powerful experience? And so we said about the research question of, what are the learning impacts for those who maybe watch a show, watch a performance, but don't actually get on stage. And so we have a whole pile of survey data that we are analyzing at the moment. And it's pretty clear that there is still a lot of high level learning that goes on, and that people are still, and I find this myself when I watch forum theater, I find it impossible, even if I'm not on the stage, to not be asking, what would I do now? What would I do now? What would I do next? What would I do if someone said that to me? So there's a lot of that self-reflexive narrative going on inside the audience members. So yeah, trying to get folks to come who have some influence. We made sure a couple of them were there yesterday, some higher folks in the university, who are maybe going to be instrumental in getting more and more professors and more opportunities for people to see this work. The criteria to identify collective learning. Well, that's something that again is this study that we're doing is an attempt to do that. But what's interesting, and there's an attention here between, because we're based in the theater of the oppressed, which is grounded in Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed. And of course, and there may be people in this meeting here who are well more versed in pedagogy of oppressed than I am. But the idea of the individual learning journey that starts with the vast lived experience that each learner brings. And I would imagine that if Freire were alive today, he would have a real trouble with the insistence on learning objectives that has really swept universities everywhere. The idea that there is a list of things that we're going to learn, and because it might pull us towards the banking model of education that he was so resistant to. And at the same time, we are asked to provide this kind of objective evidence that we are having collective learning, when it seems to me that this work really works on an individual level, because everyone is given the kind of onto epistemological latitude to make whatever they make out of what they see on the stage. We are never trying to build consensus. As the joker of the forum, to use Boal's word, my job is never to say, did you notice how so-and-so did this? That looked like a really good way of doing this, or that didn't work. Or my job is never to weigh in on what worked. My job is to simply facilitate as many ideas getting onto the stage and into the atmosphere as possible, and to allow individuals to put together their own learning journeys. There is no one. There's a paper I read where someone talked about the privileged observer who is able to stand above and say, these are the appropriate observations for you to make. And somehow I think there's something about learning objectives. Of course, they can serve a very good purpose, but the double-edged sword of learning objectives is that they can close down and sort of create a privileged observer. So we're still wrestling with how do we create that objective measure of learning. But we certainly have a strong anecdotal evidence, and a lot of it is in our survey data, that people are having profound insights regarding their own self-observation, which is hard to capture in necessarily objective measures in a traditional way. So it's an ongoing question.
Yeah. Allow me to add something to that, Tom. For us, 4 years ago, you gave us precisely, you handle a conflict case in our unit. And that was very, very, very interesting to see how this conflict was actually understood from a cybernetic point of view, in as much as the language of theater that you used allow us to become more aware of the multiple interactions and feedback loops, emotional, cognitive, moral, that were structuring the conflict.
Yeah.
And something interesting, I don't know if you remember, after you finished the course, was that the impact that the course had for many of the participants, or rather the workshop, for many of the participants in this workshop. So learning was not easy to evaluate, but what it was relatively more easy was to see how significant it was for many people that participated in that workshop, and also the impact that had in the unit, the kind of changes in transformations that the workshop brought to this unit. So in that sense, I would say that learning, of course, that's a very important issue, but also I will put in parallel how significant is this kind of interactions for the people that get involved in when there is a conflict situation in their organizations, and the awareness of what's going on is so important, at least to see what's happening, take actions that hopefully will alleviate the conflict, at least. Significance, meaningful, how meaningful is for the people involved is another thing that we have to take into account in this kind of workshops and interactions with the theater for living.
Yeah. Peter, please go ahead.
Yes, I was fascinated with this white whale idea, because when we have theater and drama, there can be all sorts of problems, but with the white whale, we're trying to make this we have this very specific sort of problem. You identify the problem. And And I wondered about this relationship between the drama and game theory, because in game theory, there are links with cybernetics and systems theory. For instance, things that like Ashby has written about. So I was thinking, like, if you think about this whale, could we compare that with a chicken game or some sort of game that has already been studied? Could that be a way of trying to categorize different sort of dramas that you or conflicts that you experience in this setting, and then make some sort of catalog or a very systematic approach on how to deal with these different types of problems?
Yeah, I think that's a really fascinating idea. I have some acquaintance with game theory, but certainly not in a deep way. So I think I take that as a really excellent suggestion to look into, because as you say, what's specifically with the white whale, yeah, we've identified almost an archetype. Well, I referred to it in the paper as a kind of to use the second order cybernetic language, as a kind of eigenform, right? A kind of
Yes.
fixed point that continues to stabilize, as a type of stabilization. And I think that's a really interesting research question to look into game theory and see what kinds of parallels we can draw. Thank you for that.
I would like Raul to invite you, especially because this connection between drama, game theory, and theater and emotions. But I think you were aware of that at Aston at what point in your past life.
Yes, thank you, Alfonso. I'm thinking, Tom and Hernán, of the connections between actors and participants in a conflicting situation. And what you are suggesting now is that in this conflict, the views of each side may move in directions that are different to the goals that were set up for the situation itself. And it's there that I am very much interested to hear the views that you have as to how to reduce the conflict between the participants and the actors, so that at the end of the day, there is a way to improve the situation or to avoid the conflict in an extreme situation, and to somehow get people to learn locally in each side to increase their capacity to connect in the connections. So to connect in the situation itself. So what is interesting is that when you mention eigenforms or eigen behaviors, I would expect that the objects that emerge in both sides are objects that somehow initially they look very conflicting, but somehow over time they may improve as the situations get more clear in the relationships within each of the sides. So we are not only talking about one side against the other. I'm also talking about how is it that within each of the actor sides or within the participant sides, they get some kind of understanding of the others and improve the situation and reduce the conflicting positions by that process of self-understanding.
Thank you very much, Raul. Yes, what I've been leaning into in a way to help us move in that direction is an offshoot of cybernetics that for me has not been sufficiently studied and taken up inside the wider systems field, and that is the perceptual control theory of William T. Powers, who initially introduced this work in the ASC American Society for Cybernetics, but then a sort of pronounced schism between Powers and Heinz von Förster took place, and Powers departed and founded his own sort of community around this theory of perceptual control theory. But it's fundamentally a cybernetic theory, and it has to do with hierarchical levels of control. And interestingly, Raul, I would love to have a conversation at some point about how it might speak to elements of the VSM, actually. But really what I try and work with is the top 3 levels of this hierarchy that Powers has identified, which is actions, and then principles, and then identity at the top. So the actions are the things that we do, and that is the level at which conflict normally erupts. Person A wants to do X, person B wants to do Y, and that's where it erupts. But those actions are in service of values. So if the actions are going to be sort of homeostatically, optimal, they need to be in line with the values, which are in lines with the identities that the individuals are trying to preserve. And moving the conversation from the level of actions, well, we should do X, no, we should do Y, up to, well, why should we do X? Why should we? What are the values that are at stake? What are the values that are being enacted by these actions? And how are those values connected to the identities that are obviously feeling threatened by this situation? And I've found that, that everything old is new again. What I've discovered is that nonviolent communication, Marshall Rosenberg's nonviolent communication, actually is designed to do exactly that. Through splitting, through getting us to talk in the language of observations rather than assessments. For instance, to say, I noticed you left work at 2:30 on Tuesday and Thursday last week, rather than to say you snuck out of work last week, right? To talk in the language of observation, to then describe the impact that what I'm observing is having on me, and then being able to name the need that I have that is not being met, is a way that we can sort of go up in the hierarchy and we change our perception. So there's a silly little example, not a major conflict, but an example of this, how perception can be shifted, that I use all the time, which is when I was a first-year theater student, I would go into the green room of the theater on the campus theater, and this 4th-year student would come in. He would pay absolutely no attention to anyone. He would go to his locker, get his books, and leave. And I created a narrative in my mind. This guy's a snob. This guy thinks he's better than all of us. He doesn't even notice we exist. And so there I am with this narrative in my head about who this guy is, and most importantly, what I think his motivations are. Well, we ended up working for the same summer theater company that summer. I got to know him, and it turned out he was painfully shy. So what he's doing is he's managing his social anxiety. So from a cybernetic perspective, he's got a different homeostatic optima that he's managing. And meanwhile, I have a need, which is and it's not linear. It's not like I'm in a neutral place and then he does this behavior and then I feel something. It actually starts with my need to feel welcomed, my need to feel recognized. So it's circular. My need is not met, and then I experience this disturbance. So I wasn't sitting there, like I say, in some neutral state, and then this linear process of his behavior hit me and made me feel something. So that's a shift in perception, that unless I can talk to him, unless I know what questions to ask him, I'll never discover that he's got a different homeostatic optima that he's controlling than the one I think he's controlling. I think his variable has something to do with me. It's nothing to do with me. So I use that as an example of hopefully the kinds of things that I think I'm hearing you mention, Raul, about how do we find ways to connect.
I think you are, and let me just connect to that, because one thing that I believe is interesting is that these aspects of action and identity are happening within certain groups of people, and I have made a point of referring to them as actors and participants. So the actors are in interaction. Whether they are aware of that or not is another problem. because somehow in a sort of epistemological sense, it may be that actors feel very much that they are part of a black box and they are just trying to do something in the world in which they operate. And what I hear you talking about, and what I hear is the issue that I feel is interesting, is to see how is it that these actors, as they interact with each other, and as a result of that, they are in processes of action, they are constructing their identities and modifying their identities in ways that transform the eigen behavior that is the one that the participants are recognizing. So if the participants recognize a black box connection, rather than eigen behaviors that are modifying and changing as the conditions of the identities of the actors are changing, and as the participants become more aware of their own interactions, then the whole situation is very different to the one where the two parts are in conflict, but there is an opportunity for communicating and for improving the situation in ways that are more conducive to avoid the unilateral impositions.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. The black box connection is something I'll take with me from this conversation and into the future work. Thank you.
Yeah.
Claudia.
Claudia.
Yeah, great. Very interesting. I'm interested in this idea of conflict because I wonder sometimes often actually oppressive situations look like perfect happiness. You know, everything looks like everyone is happy. Everyone smiles because everyone has been trained to never say anything against a particular person or disagree with a particular person. Everyone is trained to always say yes, because if they don't, they get punished. So after a while, the workplace looks perfectly happy. Everyone smiles all the time. I'm wondering what you do with a situation like that. You know, there is no obvious clash that you would immediately see, okay, there's a clash, we have to do something, you know.
So thank you for that, Claudia. Well, all of our plays are generated from the ground up. So for instance, we just completed our summer intensive. So our summer intensive, we put out an advertisement to the entire university saying we're doing our summer intensive. It's a professional development opportunity. So they get permission from whoever their supervisor is to come and spend 5 days with us. So we never start from a place of the university identifying what the conflicts are. So we start from the lived experience of individuals. So we work very hard to create a space where they feel they can name what's going on. So this conflict I described just now of the person who gets a last minute request from the professor thrust upon them. You're right. They may be just smiling and saying, oh yeah, no, I'll get that done over the weekend. And inside they're suffering, or they take that at home. So we create a space where those can be surfaced. And so because the institution is not deciding here are the conflicts that we need to do. We're starting by asking the participants in the spirit of the theater of the oppressed, which is you're the content experts. I have some expertise in a particular form of working, but the content, what are the pain points? Where are you experiencing conflict, oppression at work? It's up for you to name, and we'll build those plays. And the plays also, actually, the way the plays roll out, there's a very important part where we freeze a scene and we ask for the character's secret thoughts. And when they're in character and not playing themselves in the mask of a character, it's amazing the kinds of things they'll say about the faculty or about the organization. So we try, and I've been really adamant when we start our sessions, is that this is not an exercise in employee resilience. This is not, you know, I'm very suspicious of resilience narratives. I always say, well, we can teach homeless people to be more resilient, or we can try and do something about homelessness, right? So I try and really insist that this is not about let's improve our employees. It also needs to be a place where we can critique the institution. And so the plays, as we build them as models, I hope that they contain that element as well. And it starts with the participants are the one who tell us what are important conflicts, not from an institutional perspective.
So actually the framing as conflict is not, I mean, actually it's much wider, because it's eventually about agency too, because eventually it's about how everyone can develop the kind of agency that allows them to create the place where they want to be at.
Yeah. Yeah. And it also allows us to confront a place where there is not sufficient agency, and we don't have a magical solution in our play. We have to sit with the discomfort of seeing our institution or organization in a way that we begin to understand as oppressive.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Regarding that, Tom, have you found any difference in terms of cultures? I mean, people coming from different countries, in order to become engaged in this kind of meetings or seminars or training?
Absolutely. As everyone is aware, and I know it's playing out all over the world in different ways, I suspect that in some ways in North America, given the diversity, the fundamental diversity of the North American experience, it may be the place where it's the most pronounced, but issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion are at the top of the agenda of certainly every post-secondary institution in North America in a very pronounced way. And many of the plays that we're developing at the moment are about those issues. And people are feeling more and more free to step into the complexities of those situations. 2 of the 4 plays we just made this week dealt with issues of race and issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion in different ways, and ways that there's lateral violence between marginalized groups as incentives are put in place for certain types of hiring. We had a play where a more obviously dark-skinned racialized person is favored over a lighter-skinned or white-passing racialized person for promotion. And so in addition, yes, the people bring their different conflict styles, their different cultural training as to how do you speak to authority figures, or and generational as well. It's fascinating to see generational as well. Those who say, well, yeah, in a staff position, I have to suck it up and I have to just do this work over the weekend. And someone from another generation who says, the clock is at 5 o'clock and I'm done. Right. And those who have this idea of anything for the team, and those who have the idea of I'm on the clock when you pay me and not a minute longer, and how generationally that shows up. That was a big learning for me this last week about how ideas of sacrifice for the team showed up differently amongst people in my demographic and some of the younger people showing up. So it cuts across ethnicity, age, generation, all those different dimensions.
Yeah. Well, talking about clock, we just reached
the tyranny of the clock.
Hour. That's the end of our meeting. Raul, I think you wanted to say something. Oh yes, Hernán first. Go ahead.
Just one minor point. Conflict. What we have found, and Tom, who is a pioneer and our master in this use of theatrical languages and art for dealing with conflict, what we have found is that a conflict very often is not the bad guy of the play. It turns out that in many cases we found that conflict is a creative power, that if we are able to harness it, this creative power, we can get an interesting improvement many times in our organizations. So conflict shouldn't be seen as the bad guy of the play.
Yeah, very important.
Yeah, it seems that agency, regarding to Claudia's comment, needs some sort of tension. Raúl.
In fact, that hand, I don't know why it turned up there, you know, but obviously I am saying that I want to say something, which I always have something to say, but not this time. Never mind. I think there was a point that Tom made, which is you wanted to make a connection between these ideas that you have and Hernán have been proposing with a viable system model. Perhaps before I advance some views about that, would you explain to us how would you start discussing these ideas in the context of the viable system?
Well, perceptual control theory is really about, in the idea of keeping variables within particular acceptable limits, and that the definition of conflict that comes out of PCT is simply when two or more control systems attempt to control the same variable at different levels. So it's this very parsimonious theory of conflict that one can then apply to personal issues as well. So just sort of mapping the hierarchy as articulated by powers against the 5 systems of the VSM is a place that I've already started sort of poking around in a very beginning sort of fashion.
Because one thing that I would like to offer here is that the viable system model is a model of relationships and interaction. So when we have a group of people, like I mentioned earlier, actors in relation to some participants in the situation, what is interesting is that these actors may find themselves related to some particular aspects of the organizational system. And as they are related to some particular aspects, they may be interested to develop among themselves relationships, develop interactions among themselves. And as they do that, they change the very object that they are interacting with, the participants. And this change is not necessarily a complete move in a different direction, because as we know with eigen behaviors is that these are stable changes that are happening and producing something that is connected to the general goals that they may have, that in fact they are changing as a result of their interactions and communications. And the same is the case with the participants. The participants, as they recognize particular values and concerns in what they hear from the actors, they may, as a result of that, produce something that changes their own behaviors and values and produce different ethical aspects. And at the same time, they are changing the actors who are not necessarily a viable system. There are essentially groups of people, agents, as Claudia was suggesting, which are somehow changing the identity of their interactions as time goes by. And that's where the situation is altered and changed. So that would be my connection with the issues that you are raising about conflict and how is it that these interactions are conducive to a better understanding of the situation.
Thank you, Raul.
Good. Andy.
Hi there. Thank you, Tom. I came just a little bit late. I just want to make one point that I learned last night or the night before, I believe. Fascinating. I'm working with an organization in Africa to try to solve some problems that the funding system will not allow to solve. And the fascinating thing is that, and I'd love to talk with you offline about this, but I'm finding that inclusion prevents those problems from being solved because inclusion requires consensus. And there are some problems that I call low signal to noise problems that are problems where, like problems of disruptive innovation, only one person out of 1,000 is never consensus. So if the process is forcing you towards the consensus, it's preventing you from solving the problem. This is something that we're facing in Africa because all current funding models don't fund the networks of solutions that the literature is unanimous in saying can radically increase our outcomes on existential challenges like poverty, etc. So this inclusion is forcing consensus, which is preventing disruptive solutions. So feel free to comment on that now, but I'd love to talk to you offline about that if you have any ideas on how we could solve that.
Wow, yeah. When it comes to those types of things, I tend to turn to critical systems heuristics as Werner Ulrich's critical systems heuristics is something that knowing that there is no optimum, there's no agreeable solution, but we can, like, it's something that we can all agree to, but that we're going to get clear on the epistemological and more literal boundaries of the problem area and on what counts as expertise, who speaks for those affected by the decision but not directly involved in the decision making.
Okay, from my perspective, it's very clear.
Yeah,
network solutions can exponentially increase impact on poverty, etc. Consensus doesn't allow network solutions.
Right.
There's a very clear. It's very clear which solutions are optimal.
Yeah.
It's very clear that this process can't select those solutions.
Right.
So,
yeah. And is there latitude to redesign the process?
Consensus does not allow that.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, unfortunately, I'm going to have to run right after this meeting, but my email available to folks through this network? Alfonso, is that possible?
Yeah, we can share. If you allow me, we can share with all of them.
That would be great. And then Andy, if you can shoot me an email, I would love to set up a time to be able to talk further with you about this.
Perfect. So Valentina will send you the email. So thank you very much for every one of you to participate in this conversation. Unfortunately, Igor could not make it. He apologized for that. And we will let you know the date and the time for the next meeting. Thank you again for all of you. Thank you very much.
All so much.
And thank you very much, Tom.
Thank you. And again, apologies for the late start.
Thank you.
It's all right, Tom.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.